So what could you learn from an independent musician who has 12 billion music streams and downloads since 2007? That's amazing. Who I'm talking about is my old friend, Michael Silverman. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Hey, Bob, how are you?
Good. Welcome to the Inspired Life. Full disclosure here, you and I go way back. I figure we've known each other like 35 years, man.
I think that's about right. Yeah.
So the late 80s, I was publishing a local music newspaper, and I covered your band, which is called Downtown Trio, way back when. And I think that's when we
Yeah.
first met. And we stayed in touch, and you've even played on the same stage together.
If you remember, we were your band for a very few gigs. That was a proud moment for me.
And likewise. So even though we're like local, St. Louis guys, I think you're kind of like a hidden gem or a wonder. You are like one of the most accomplished entrepreneurial musicians that I know. Like, you don't really do a whole lot of interviews, do you?
No, not really. Not that many people actually know what it is I'm up to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's
Behind the scenes, we have a band, like everyone has a band. But no, I mean, a lot of what we're doing is not front and center until they understand sort of what's going on with our label. My brother Rob and I created Autumn Hill Records, and that's where it's all happening.
Right. I grabbed this up on your bio, and I got a couple of updated figures from you before we hit the record button here. But so let me just kind of introduce people, because I know you well, but in case they're coming, learning about you for the first time. So Michael Silverman is an American pianist, keyboard player, and composer. He performs and records classical, jazz, and new age music. And you are among the most downloaded solo pianists. I would guess, well, I don't know about pop stars, maybe, a Drake or somebody is more, but one of the most downloaded solo pianists in the world with 12 billion music downloads and streams. Now it says here 14 number one albums in the classical new world music and new age charts. Has that been updated?
The charts got harder to follow, and we haven't even kept up. I mean, it was 14 about 10 years ago. So
Okay,
I don't even.
But yeah, we're going to come back to this, because this is like this amazing. Your solo projects, things that you've worked on, you accumulate 1 billion streams a year. I think it's 3 million tracks a day are streamed that you have touched, and that is just amazing. We're going to unpack that history, how you got to this point, and all the other amazing things that you've done. Your music has also appeared in hundreds of film and TV productions, including 2.5 Men, The Good Wife, American Horror Story. You said World News Tonight, NASCAR has used your music, and then Naked and Afraid. I guess it's a reality show I've never heard of, but it's even appeared there. You mentioned already that you and your brother, Rob Silverman, who is an excellent drummer, you're the founders of Autumn Hill Records. This is one of the largest instrumental record labels in the world. That's a pretty bold claim, but that's true.
I don't know how many instrumental labels are able to stream 1 billion a year, so I imagine that is true. You
mentioned you're touring. You have a touring band, Bach to the Future, which I think is a great name. You perform Beethoven symphonies, Bach fugues in a variety of styles. And then you and your brother founded several music festivals in St. Louis. You're the owner of Clayton Studios here. Wow, there's just a lot here. I think the most impressive thing, the thing that will really get a lot of people's attention, is these streaming numbers. So let's just talk a little bit about the history of that. I assume that you got into the streaming game pretty early on when it was first available. Is that true?
Yeah, and I don't know how much of the success is attributable to that, but yeah, I think that we got in as soon as we realized it was possible. And my brother and I record constantly. We spend more time in the studio than we do playing live. We had already built a big music library before it was available to do that, to release stuff digitally that way. But we were interested back in the 90s. There was you may remember a website called mp3.com.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
And I mean, we were putting stuff there just because you could. And we just thought that was so exciting. So as we constantly followed it, when Napster hit the scene and everyone was understandably freaked out about its effect on the music business, I thought maybe it's a bad thing in some way, but it's also obviously a good thing, because everybody at the time really did want to have a way to, listen to music on their computers and eventually their phones. And the CDs are expensive and they're not good for the environment and all that. And it is cheaper to listen to more music. It's more organized, So anyway, I thought Napster was a huge breakthrough, even though nobody could make any money on it, obviously.
Let me just jump in here, because most musicians these days, you always hear a chorus of complaints about streaming ruin the music industry, right? And we just don't make money off of CDs or whatever downloads like you used to. I just like your sort of positive spin on this, but it's based in reality. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe you can help me articulate this, that people purchase a CD or an album, it's a one-time purchase. They go on their merry way, and that's it. Like, tell me, like, what are some of the benefits? One is people can come back and listen to it repeatedly, and every time they do, you make those pennies, right? Through streaming, through the buffet, like a Spotify and Apple Music offers, you can explore and discover new artists without having to purchase an album, right? So are those a couple of the big selling points in your mind?
Okay, so there's two parts. There's the consumer end of it. I think the consumers obviously it's better for consumers. I mean, we all had scratch CDs, on the floor of our car, and and you're losing things and you're buying things multiple times, and the formats were changing too. And burned CDs didn't work a lot in certain players, and all the issues with the physical media. I remember the first time I opened up iTunes and I searched for Stanley Clarke, and I saw all of it there in chronological order, searchable. And I thought, okay, I'm done. I'm done with CDs. I knew it was over. But anyway, so from a consumer standpoint, you can get music for free, or you can get it for a few dollars a month and get it ad-free on different services. So obviously the consumer should be happy with that. But a lot of people assume that artists can't do anything with it. Here's what I say. It's always been really, really hard to make any money from selling any music at all. It's always been that way. Very few people have ever made a lot of money selling music on physical media. So it just starts with, we all fondly remember when artists used to be so rich, but they really weren't. I mean, Van Halen sold 1 million of their first CD, or first vinyl album. Mm-hmm. They sold 1 million in the first year. And then they sat down with the record label at the end of the year and they were in debt. It's just so hard to make money because there's so many ways that record labels make it complicated. It's expensive to distribute. There's so much lost and breakage and impossible to track.
And people reminisce about the glory days, the good old days, but really back then they were complaining about other things, if I recall, right?
So as not to get into too much St. Louis lore, you and I remember during your Spotlight magazine era, and as I was coming up playing with these, alongside a bunch of bands that had record deals, that none of them panned out. I mean, really none of them. Everybody came back angry at the record label, and some of them came back broker than they started. Yeah. So the music business has always been really, really hard. The nice thing about the digital era is that whatever you make, it's usually starting from zero and not a negative number. You're starting from somewhere, and then everything you make, you really make. Digitally, the money is tracked, I think, pretty darn well. I haven't really run into any serious accounting issues that didn't eventually get solved automatically later. It seems like everything we've done in the digital world has eventually come back to us and paid off. So that's great. And I mean, if it's just fractions of a penny, I just think you probably have to put out a fair amount of music. We've put out over 900 different albums and compilations.
And I think that's part of the key to your success. But you hadn't had this all figured out right out of the gate. In 2007, I think you said, is when you started getting your music in there through this company called CD Baby that is still around, and they're a digital aggregator, a distributor. We were talking before the recording. Back then, you had to actually mail in a CD that they had to rip, to be able to get it into the system. It's a lot different now. Yeah. But you started off not with success. I think, didn't you start out like doing things like in jazz and things that you and your brother were doing, and those weren't necessarily the most successful albums, right?
Exactly. No, I mean, we, just like many bands, we were recording the music that we wanted to record, and we were early on, and those CDs never made money. We would sell some at shows, and we sold some through consignment at shops and things like that. It was in the hundreds of dollars a year, or maybe, if we were lucky, I don't know, maybe thousands, but it never was much. So that's how it started. Aside from being this jazz fusion keyboard player, I mean, there was no money in that. There's still not a lot of money in that in my world, but it's just a passion of mine to play that kind of progressive rock and jazz fusion music. But I also love solo piano music, and came from a classical family, and we listened to a lot of classical and new age piano music at home. And I really got into it as a teenager. And I'm really glad I learned that style. I love it artistically, but it's been the thing that I stream by far more than anything else.
And so how did you discover that? Did you put out, like, you just said, I'm going to try this. I'm going to put out a solo piano thing and just see what happens?
I was looking for Christmas music on iTunes, and all the Christmas piano albums that I ran across, almost all of them, were a little bit showy or a little too jazzy. And I had this idea about a kind of a very, very straight, kind of a solemn way of playing, really traditional Christmas music that I really felt was something that would probably sell a little bit. And so I released it, put it out in September of 2007, just in time for the holidays. Like in January of 2008, I got $500. Like it was kind of a minor hit. And I was super, super excited about it. And I thought, I actually found a way to connect a little bit with just the piano. I'd started to record my own versions of updated classical music, stuff that I grew up listening to and had arranged my own way. I tried to make them not sound, like from 1725, try to give them a little bit of a new age style, and to also take the parts of those pieces that people really recognize and just make them into sort of new age arrangements of classical pieces that people knew. And that became a little bit of a hit. So when I say a hit, they would chart a little bit on iTunes. You have those small charts a little bit, like they made it into, number 87. I mean, I'm doing cartwheels because I'd never thought that this could be a thing. And it was just exciting.
Yeah, it's very similar to when I started doing affirmations on YouTube. Actually, it was during a period around 2016, 2017 when I was just experimenting with YouTube. I put out some meditation music. I put out like a guided meditation, the typical relaxing stuff. Then I put out an affirmation on abundance because I was actually something I was struggling with myself and was seeking out this type of material, not happy with what I found. So I said, I'm going to put out something on my own. Will anybody like my voice? I have no idea. So just put it out there. But that affirmation ended up getting more views, and that's a signal, right? So I think that's the key to here is you put a lot of different stuff out, pay attention to what's resonating with people, and then lean more into that. Is that safe to say that was your approach too?
If I could create kind of a larger arc for me and you, of my knowing you, Rob and I had your guerrilla music marketing book, right, and we poured over that book, and it was just full of so many good ideas. I'm thinking that's in the early 90s, late 90s. I can't remember when it was that we got that book.
You probably got it in I put it out the first version of it in like 96. And it was like a 3-ring binder, really primitive version of it. You might have got it mid to late 90s.
That sounds about right. But we loved that book. I should actually go back just a little further. We loved your approach to Spotlight Magazine. Part of it was just pure joy. It was plain spoken. It wasn't a frilly magazine. It was just about the music scene and celebrating all the people that we all knew. And we all were excited to read about each other, and it helped elevate the scene. And then from there, when you started talking about music marketing, the way that you approached it was great because it was also just good ideas. They were all mostly inexpensive things you could do, and they didn't require you to drop everything else to do them. You could just try lots and lots of things. And we got that from it. And we did try some of the things that you said, and you pointed us in directions, and we learned about the music business. We never learned, I still don't know anything about the music business in a way. People ask me, what do they ask me specific technical things about, I really don't know that much about the way it really works in the real world.
The traditional music business, because you've definitely you figured out your own path, but maybe not the traditional route.
Right. You were instrumental in that. You really helped us to realize that you can just try things. Some of them were just funny, You're like, I just heard from this guy. He tried this. And then it was a paragraph in your book. And I just thought it was so great because it just expanded our minds on what's possible.
This interview isn't about me, but I do appreciate you pointing that out. And it's nice that I've had an influence on people like you. In my earliest books were on music marketing way before the affirmation era. Although, I had this revelation. My first book before the Guerrilla Music Marketing Handbook was called 101 Ways to Make Money in the Music Business. That came out in you remember when that came out? Like 93?
I had that one too.
In the introduction, I had completely forgotten about this, but I picked up this book for the first time in many years. And in the introduction, I talk about affirmations and reframing that whole starving artist thing. So I've been preaching this stuff. I even forgot that I had 30 years, And so
Right.
not
Yeah.
surprising that I came around to that whole importance of mindset.
It's interesting because actually, I mean, I think I did revisionist history because that's actually the first book that we had. That's the
Okay.
one where I love that it just had a million ideas. That's the one I'm
Yeah.
actually referencing. So yeah, it's been a long time. I can't remember which is which.
That's
but
okay.
we had-
Yeah. I just wanted to make you aware of 3 music marketing resources with an emphasis on one in particular. There's a good chance you're already familiar with my flagship title called the Guerrilla Music Marketing Handbook, and perhaps even the 5-Minute Music Marketer. Both of those titles are well worth your time, but I want to make you aware of another title that doesn't quite get the attention as those two do. And that one is called The 9 Irrefutable Laws of Music Marketing. I'm really proud of this book, and I think you would get a lot out of it. And basically what it covers is what I consider to be 9 timeless principles of music marketing. So regardless of the new website, app, or tool, because they're always changing, as you know, these are principles you can apply no matter what. They're timeless. They tap into that eternal connection that people have with music and with music makers. So I think you would get a lot out of this book. It's available on Amazon in at least a dozen countries in both paperback and ebook formats. So go check it out, The 9 Irrefutable Laws of Music Marketing. One theme here that I want to get back to is this idea of being prolific, playful, experimental, and just putting a lot of stuff out there. It's something that I've done, and I think that we share, but I think your success in streaming and probably a lot of other areas that we haven't even touched on yet comes from this, like, let's just get stuff out into the world. You have to move beyond the perfection curse, and maybe it was easier for you because it's solo piano as opposed to having to do, although you still did full band stuff too. But let's just talk about that. How has the role of just being prolific in your output benefited you as a musician?
I would say that starting in my 20s, when I started recording, one of the first things I got into was writing jingles. And some of them were like traditional jingles, like you think of with a little tagline at the end of a commercial. But a lot of it was just underscore music for commercials and for little documentaries, and anyone who wanted music on anything I was excited about. And one of the great things about doing that was that I also knew that I got to keep all of that music. So even if they were just 30-second bits, I was collecting up a library. And I had to learn how to create music from scratch quickly. And so, in Pro Tools, I learned to, create templates so that I could just sit down and begin recording right away with everything set. So learning to use templates and reusing templates over and over to just dive right into certain sounds, that was really helpful because I was gathering things up on digital audio tapes and things.
This doesn't only apply to musicians. I always thought to say, to really get creative, you have to dedicate not only a time to do your art or your music or whatever it is you're writing, but also a space. The most prolific that I was as a visual artist, which I really don't do much these days, was when I actually had a space and I had my paint set out and like all the tools were there. And when I got inspired, I was ready. I sat down and got to work. The same thing can happen technologically. Like you have your space, and so when you're ready, if you have to spend 30 minutes setting it up every time, you're not going to be very likely to follow through on that. I think you can apply that to any discipline, but that's great advice.
Right. And then I remember it was January 2nd of 2000, because I know that the holiday had just finished and I was real excited about making a cold call to Clayton Studios, the place that I now own. But I called Dick Hewlett, who I had only gotten to meet through working on a couple of jingles before that. But I called him up because I thought, well, here's an industry professional who probably would have some ideas. And he immediately said, I would love to have a whole library at our studio. And as long as you're making a library of music, you could probably shop it to other studios. So I remember that it was at the beginning of 2000. And for that whole year, I tried to create 3 pieces of music every day throughout the year. So I had hundreds of pieces of music. And that became the Autumn Hill Music Library later. It just really focused my ability to create a lot of music. I also wanted every style. I would do 3 reggae pieces today, and tomorrow was 3 techno pieces, and the next day it'd be 3 Native American style things if I could pull it off, or whatever it was. And I was just trying everything, so I'd have a large library of music. And that was a huge year for me in terms of learning how to just get work done, just creating material,
Wow.
creating content before people were saying creating content.
Yeah. And so you were laying the foundation for what was to come, probably not even realizing this would benefit you later. I had a similar experience. We mentioned this music magazine that I used to publish. I did that for 10 years. I also worked in the corporate world in internal communications for 4 or 5 years, but I haven't had a day job in over 20 years now. I learned a lot from having deadlines. There was always a deadline. I couldn't wait for the muse to arrive. When I was in the mood to write an article, I had to write when it was time to get the thing out there. And while I still do like to be inspired, and jump on something when that lightning strike of inspiration, there's something to be said for just writing, sitting down and creating, and maybe even when you don't feel like it, sometimes just the act of starting kind of gets the juices flowing, and then you're in that creative mode, so you don't have to wait for inspiration to strike, to sit down and do the work.
I have a friend named Jay Oliver. You may know Jay.
I do know him, yeah.
Yeah, Jay is a great composer and engineer and fantastic keyboard player and musician. And one thing I noticed about just watching him work was we didn't really talk about those sort of, magical, inspirational moments, which do happen, of course. I was just sort of amazed with his ability to just sit down and, hit record and just start playing and seeing what comes out and just crafting and massaging something into something amazing every time. I realized that he never talked about that thing where you had to wait for the muse. And I realized it's a lot of times just beginning to play the instrument. The muse strikes 5 minutes in. I mean, it almost always does now. It's like I have a way to kind of kickstart it now. Sometimes it's just putting on, laying down a drum track. Either I play it in with the keys or, my brother has, electric drums he can play right in. So it's like super fast to get, something happening just as a reference. And just feeling the beat, I'm inspired to begin to create something. It might only be 8 measures of music, but I can always create and not worry about if I'm going to write, the next Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but just create something. Because usually over time, there's lots of moments of inspiration in every project. It gets better and better. And so I think that's something that creative people who do it all the time learn how to do, is not to think about, that a certain event is going to trigger something. I mean, that's great when that happens, but that's not how an artist can consistently work. You're just waiting for the ideas to hit you all the time.
So I love this conversation. I hope, again, you don't have to be a musician to benefit from this concept, whether you're somebody in the creative fields or you're a coach or somebody in the healing arts or whatever. I mean, the more that you do that thing you create, the more well-honed you're going to get, the easier it's going to come, whether you're initially in the mood or not. You have been really smart about having these themed albums. I think once you figured out that I can create, like your first, the Christmas album, that did really well. It has a theme, Christmas music. Talk about some of the different themed albums that you put out over the years that did really well, and what's the thought process behind that? Like some musicians go, "Oh, you're just being, Does you ever get any pushback from other creatives?"
I'll tell you how I would answer that is going from our band, the Downtown Trio. It was named that generically. We didn't, we were young and we didn't actually know what we wanted to sound like with it. We wanted to make instrumental music. And we said, let's just give it a generic name so we're not forced into a box. Well, it wasn't a great name. I mean, it's really not. It's so unmemorable. But it was, at the time, we just needed some place to start. That same band evolved into Bach to the Future. Still my brother and I and our friend from down the street, Matt Bollinger, and we all grew up together, and we had the Downtown Trio, and eventually we started to do a theme, though, which was taking these classical pieces that I loved and creating this sort of instrumental fusion out of it. So suddenly there was a theme. There was something to work with, and it also grabbed a lot of attention. And that was exciting because we thought it was a cool idea, but we were almost certain that it had no chance of doing anything, because it was like, now we're getting even more of a niche than we were. We tried to be very generic as an instrumental group with just a nice sounding music was the hope. But it turned out that when we chose this little niche of instrumental classical fusion with Latin, it was such a weird, twisty thing with a funny name. That was actually the trick. That's the thing that worked.
Right.
So you never know what's going to work. But I think that it taught me that everything should have a theme. Like a lot of my favorite artists have picked some kind of a new thing, a new strategy. When you hear an interview with any band you've ever heard of, like
you're a big Rush fan. Isn't 2112 kind of a theme album a bit?
Let's go with that. I like Rush. But what bands will do is they'll say it's almost always an idea that 2112 was a theme. Like progressive rock bands often have an entire album that's one giant, almost one song, right? It's all connected, and so that kind of thematic writing is great. Any great album, there's some kind of a thing that they reference. Like I wanted to put it into this mold. I wanted to, and sometimes the artist has a new look, and the band they cut some things out and they added something, and they think this is the new thing. It's not a perfect example of what you're talking about, but the idea is that you kind of create some kind of a box to build in and see if people like this new thing. But I love bands that have a theme, and I love compilation albums that are built around a mood, which is a lot of what new age compilations are. Well, you even hear it now with like summer playlists, right? I mean, It's not even an album. It's a group of songs from different artists, but it's like you're just trying to connect with an audience where they are right now.
Right.
And or you might take them somewhere if they hadn't thought of it. But something like a summer playlist is that kind of a thing where you're just connecting with where someone might want to look. And so you want to be where somebody's looking and have something good for them to find.
So let me see what the parallels are between the success of my Affirmations YouTube channel. I think I benefited, and I'm blessed that I'm creating stuff that people are actively searching for. And knowing that, I strategically name it and describe it in the terms that they're going to be using to look for that type of thing. So is it safe to say that with these many themed albums that you've done, and there's probably, I don't know, hundreds of them that you put out, that you've done that too? I mean, so it's a bit of strategic thinking that goes into this. What's popular now, or what are people searching for? And how does that overlap with what I enjoy playing as a solo piano artist?
Exactly. I did an album that's, I would say, my best-selling jazz record. I don't sell a ton of jazz, even though I love jazz. But we had this idea for an album called Jazz for a Rainy Day. And I see that it's been done many times since. That album really connected, and it had the whole album had a certain vibe that I think really just kind of came from I had this image about like, what kind of jazz would you want to hear on a rainy day? The melancholy, slow, simple jazz vibe, very slow tempos and so on. That one stayed on the iTunes chart for years. It may still be there, but it always sort of hovered in the 70s or 80s in the charts. Right. And I've always been really proud of that because I feel like we hit a vibe. Certainly in the jazz world, I'm not a well-known artist, I have these things like that sometimes hit. And I love when that happens.
And if people just search Spotify or Apple Music and for Micheal Silverman, they're gonna find a lot of your stuff there, right? And they can definitely search for all the different themes, albums that you've had. That concludes part 1 of my interview with Mike Silverman. Stay tuned for part 2 coming soon.